Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Since 2006, June has been designated Caribbean American Heritage Month in the United States. All month long, we celebrate the rich culture and heritage of the Caribbean and their contributions to the United States. This year, the Embassy has hosted several online discussions about the Caribbean connection with the United States. The first conversation reflected on the documentary Beyond Barbados, The Carolina Connection. Last week, we explored the Gulagi Cultural Heritage Corridor, and today we are pleased to host our final program, The Role of Youth in Social Activism and Democratic Participation. I would like to welcome Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, and Professor Zizwe Poe of Lincoln University, one of the historical Black universities in Pennsylvania. Both Barbadian heroes Clement Osborne Payne and United States civil rights leader Martin Luther King demonstrated incredible leadership before their lives were cut short before the age of 40. Other young 1960s civil leaders included Harry Belafonte and Coane Toure, both of whom have strong ties to the Caribbean. Today's discussion is about how a new generation of leaders can advance the values of equality and diversity the young leaders like Payne and King championed. I hope that you listen and participate in this program and you reflect on the meaningful impact you as a young leader can have on your community and in the world. I am very grateful to Sir Hilary for his participation today, and certainly welcome and the participation of Dr. Poe to join us all today. Thank you very much. Dr. Poe, I'd like to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Taglia Latella. It is indeed a great honor to even participate in this program, but I want to keep my comments short. What I want to try to do is spend time to introduce right now Professor Sir Hilary Beckles and share the title, and then we will allow him to bless us with the information, and then I will facilitate some of the questions and answers, which I'm sure there will be many near the end of this presentation. Just a little background on Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, in case some people don't know. He's the 8th Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, is a distinguished academic, international thought leader, United Nations Committee official, and global public activist in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. Sir Hilary received his higher education in the United Kingdom and is Professor of Economic History. He has lectured extensively in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and I should say on YouTube, in case you don't know about that also, and has published over 100 peer-reviewed essays in scholarly journals, over 13 books on subjects ranging from Atlantic and Caribbean history, gender relations in the Caribbean, sport development, and popular culture. Sir Hilary has widespread Caribbean and global recognition for his academic achievements and leadership expertise. He has received numerous awards, including the degrees of Honorary Doctor of Letters from Brock University in Canada, the University of Glasgow in Scotland, his alma mater, the University of Hull in England, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana, and the degree Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters from the University of the Virgin Islands in recognition of his major contribution to academic research into transatlantic slavery, popular culture, and sport. In 2007, he received a knighthood, Commander Knight of St. Andrew, the highest national honor in Barbados, in recognition of his distinguished service in the fields of education, sports, and the arts. In 2015, he was honored by the Borough of Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, speak out for Brooklyn. I know there's a bunch of Brooklyn people here. Brooklyn, New York, for extraordinary achievement, outstanding leadership, and contribution to the community. That same year, he also received the second Global Community Healer Award for humanitarian work from the Community Healer Network, Washington, D.C., following the legendary Maya Angelou. In 2016, he received the Ciersu Award of Honor from the government of Dominica. for his contribution to the Commonwealth of Dominica and the region in the field of education. If I jacked up that pronunciation, I'm sure he will clear it up for me in a minute. In 2017, the town of Hartland in the state of Connecticut declared the 21st of March Sir Hilary Beckles Day in recognition of his global contribution to social justice and human equality. He is also a recipient of the prestigious Amistad Award from Central Connecticut State University, honoring his outstanding contribution to historical knowledge and the struggle for human rights. In August 2020, Sir Hilary was named a Paul Harris Fellow by the Rotary Foundation in recognition of his extensive work as a thought leader in the field of social justice and minority empowerment. In January 2021, his global advocacy for reparatory justice, equality, and economic development for people of the African diaspora was recognized with the conferral of the Martin Luther King Jr. 2021 Global Award for Peace and Freedom by the U.S. National Action Network. So Hilary is the president of University of Caribbean, chairman of the Caribbean Examinations Council, chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, advisor on sustainable development to former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, director of the Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center, as well as a long-serving director of Sagicor Financial Corporation, the largest international financial services conglomerate in the Caribbean region. In March 2021, the United Nations invited Sir Hilary to serve as an expert for his Futures of Higher Education project, led by UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. The project is intended to generate innovative and visionary ideas about the purpose and functions of higher education. And today, Sir Hilary will be speaking on the role of youth in social activism and democratic participation, among whatever other concepts he wants to bring up in this presentation. So we look forward to your presentation, Sir Hilary, and without further ado, please let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Poe. Thank you. Allow me also to recognize Her Excellency, our distinguished U.S. Ambassador to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, and with my ability to take liberty to call her Linda. It's wonderful to be with you and to thank you for framing this conversation of U.S. Caribbean relations and issues of heritage. And Professor Poe, for the generosity of your invitation to speak on a matter which is very close to my heart, which is the one America concept. Mm-hmm. Well, as you would appreciate, I have a propensity to historicize because that's what I am. And I cannot think of the relationship between the United States and the Caribbean outside of that context, because they all originated from the same source, which is the British Empire. All of these islands, the United States, most of those United States were colonies of Britain, as was the Caribbean. But the remarkable thing about this history is how the world has been turned upside down by time. Because in the 17th century, when the US colonies were being developed by Britain and those colonies in the Caribbean was the center, and what became the United States were the periphery. And that is interesting. That is so very interesting that the Caribbean was the center of this American enterprise. And the colonies of Virginia and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York, all of these, the Carolinas, they were the periphery of the Caribbean center. And since, of course, economic value was used as the way to rank colonies, what was your contribution to international trade? What was your impact on the British economy? How much value did you generate towards the empire? And if you take a moment in time, let us say 1700. It was Barbados number 1, Jamaica number 2, Virginia number 3, Carolina number 4. And that was the ranking that was available at the time in terms of the economic base that existed. And the Caribbean economic base in the 17th century was hundreds of times larger than the economic base of the US colonies. And this is why the US colonies, they look to the Caribbean for leadership in international trade and finance. Not surprising, therefore, that since we know that all of these colonial economies were built upon enslaved African labor, that emerged out of the indenture of white European workers, that the Caribbean had both the largest number of white indentured servants as well as the largest number of enslaved Africans. Virginia was competitive, but it was trailing by quite a distance behind Barbados and Jamaica in terms of the population of white indentured servants and the population of enslaved Africans. So it is interesting how all of that has happened. I mean, one of the consequences of culture that is oftentimes forgotten is as a result of that integration, the Caribbean was the site of expansion. And therefore, the Caribbean political leaders and the economic elite, they were the ones who approached the King of England and they said, listen, we have maximized our potential in the Caribbean. We, the sugar planters, the slave traders, we are now the richest men in the Americas, and we need room to grow. We need to expand. And it was the King of England that said, yes, well, you can have the Carolinas. That's available to you. So South Carolina, we heard Her Excellency spoke about the Carolina connection, because the Carolinas were given to the Barbados and Jamaican slave owners to expand and grow north. Go north and make a fortune. So, you know, in the Caribbean, it was sugar and slavery. In the Carolinas, it was rice and slavery. But it was driven by the same group of people. So, yes, fast forward 300 years, and we see that world was turned on its head. The United States is now the center, and the view is in terms of economic structure, impact, capacity, the Caribbean is now on the periphery. But it's the dialectics of that process that is the subject of today's conversation. How time can make fools of us, or how it can enlighten us. But first of all, we must know it. If you take one moment, here is another example. In 1675, the enslaved people of Barbados, because at that moment, Barbados had the largest enslaved African population in all of the Americas. There was no colony, there was no society in North America or anywhere that had 80,000 enslaved Africans. Barbados was the center of the African population. Barbados became the first colony, the first society in the Americas where Africans became a majority. Barbados, at its height with 80,000 enslaved Africans, had only 20,000 white people. So 20,000 white people. Also the largest white population for a colony. Virginia, New York, Philadelphia, none of them, Pennsylvania, none of them had as many white people as Barbados did, or as many African peoples. So in that center, in that American center called Barbados, there was an organized rebellion to achieve freedom. It was the first freedom plan that was organized colony-wide, not in a part of it, but a colony-wide attempt by the African peoples to find, to secure, and restore their freedom. What was remarkable about that moment? Well, first of all, the plan was discovered on the eve of its implementation. What were the consequences? When the news of this African freedom struggle became available to the American colonies, New York closed its borders to Barbados. Virginia closed its borders to Barbados. Pennsylvania, South Carolina, they all closed, they went to their assemblies and said that this colony, Barbados, is the center of this African freedom struggle. And they want to infect the rest of the hemisphere with it. So the North American colonies all went to their assemblies and legislated the closing of their borders for ships coming from Barbados and for any Black people coming from Barbados as slaves, even with their masters and the mistresses. So Barbados became quarantined. The spirit of revolution and freedom, it was a quarantine so that this practice of this notion of Black freedom would not contaminate the other colonies. So that gives you an example of how interconnected. Now, those white people in Barbados who were now fearful of their lives, fearful of their future, large numbers of them migrated to Virginia, migrated to the Carolinas to get away from the threat of African freedom. Took their families, took their capital, and they moved out. So again, you see this incredible moment of movement. I would argue today that nothing has changed. The Caribbean continues to be the center of this notion of freedom. The Caribbean continues to be the place where people are speaking about democracy. People are speaking about plurality, diversity. It is a place where people are speaking about multi-racial society, where people could live in peace of all races and cultures, because the Caribbean became the world's first global village. The Caribbean is the place where we have millions of Europeans, millions of Africans, millions of Asians, India, China. We have, and of course, we then have millions of the intermixture of all of those, creating this rainbow coalition. And so you have Jamaica with a motto that says, out of many, one people. You have Trinidad that has a motto that speaks of the rainbow nation. So what is celebrated in the iconography of politics is diversity, plurality, multiracial democracy. We are stronger together. We share the space. We politicize strategic planning, and then we go forward. So the Caribbean has a history that also mirrors today what our colleagues in the United States are now trying to achieve. If you listen to the narrative of American politics at the moment, it is now the eruption of plurality. It's the eruption of equality of everyone, not just the language, not just the rhetoric, but the demonstration of commitment to that notion of multi-plural, diverse democracy. So yes, the Caribbean has been in that political space for several generations. And this is why when Caribbean folks, when they migrate to the United States, they are bringing from the Caribbean this history, this culture. And it's the young people who are carrying this, so that when a young Marcus Garvey moved from the Caribbean into the United States and decided that, listen, we need to move democracy along. And he was able to build the largest Black organization the world has ever seen. And he did it through charisma, politics, negotiation, but bring in that Caribbean democratic impulse, the impulse to democracy, bringing that into the United States. Not surprising that many of our great civil rights leaders as young men, and you must remember, Marcus Garvey was in his 20s when he was doing this. He was in his 20s and his early 30s. Then we have men like Malcolm X, who came also from a Caribbean sensibility, some Caribbean parenting, creating in his consciousness a certain kind of vision. And of course, we go on and on. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, we go on and on. We have that. When we watch Barack Obama, when we look at him, we say he moves and think like an island person. He's an islander. He has that island thing about him. Well, that's his Hawaiian background, but he has that island thing, that swagger, that island confidence. Yes, I'm a young black man, but I have that island thing, it's there. So we have a history of all of that. And it's a history that shows the integrated nature of the Americas. It shows that integrated culture of migration, of economic patterns and relations. There have always been this intimate symbiotic relation between the continent and its islands. We are the islands off the coast of the continent. You are the continent beyond our shores. And therefore the island and its mainland, that beautiful relationship between the land mass and the smaller mass, it is much more than geography. It had always been political, cultural, ideological. Just last week, I was invited to participate in the Shirley Chisholm Center as a director. This is a project built out by the State University of New York to celebrate the life and legacy of Shirley Chisholm. She's coming out of that Barbados upbringing, that Barbados upbringing of women, Caribbean women who don't sit around and allow masculinity to run roughshod over them. She's coming out of that Caribbean affirmative culture of young women in the Caribbean who were in the labor movement, who were in the independence movement, breaking away from Britain, ending the colonial legacy. She's coming out of that, goes into the United States, where she's brought up in Brooklyn and in that Barbadian household, West Indian community. And boy, was she feisty. First black woman to rise up and say, I need to be the president of my country. I see no reason why I cannot be the president of my nation. And made all of the arrangements and made all of the plans. And when you listen to her, diversity, democracy, equality, women's rights, young people's voices to be articulated, young people always in the vanguard, saying things that are shocking the elders. But what the young people are saying becomes the norm of tomorrow. And without that youth voice that is fearless and confident about change and transformation, that is the voice that has always been the vehicle on which democracy has traveled. It never trickles down from the imagination of elders. It always is from the energy of young people pushing the barriers, demanding justice, demanding equality. And what tends to happen is generation by generation, more and more young people are seeing the importance of living a plural life, in and out of communities, in and out of ethnicities, loving who you want, living with whom you want, seeing other people around you as your co-citizens, equal, wanting to actualize that, wanting to be who you are, a product of the mosaic, the beauty of multiple colors, diversity in human nature and the politics of reality. And so we have every good reason to always be focusing on the young people. Just a week ago, the government of Guyana finally admitted that their greatest historian and political orator and leader of multiracialism, born and bred in a plural society where half of the people are African descent, the other half are from Indian descent, and creating a formula that says the country has a future only in building intimate bridges of cooperation between these two major ethnicities. We do not want the politics of race. We do not want the politics of tension of ethnicities. We want a new vision, a deeply integrated national vision. And for that, he lost his life, assassinated. Lost his life. The greatest political thinker, the greatest scholar and historian of that nation was assassinated. And he was only 38 years old, known all over the world as the greatest post-colonial scholar. And he was 38 years old, a young man who had made his impact in his 20s upon the world, taken up the struggle for global justice. And this is all very important. So we have every good reason to be celebrating our youth, to be calling upon them to do what we know they always do best. Look beyond the walls, look beyond the barriers, and imagine a better space. We in the Caribbean have always seen ourselves as a part of the American journey. We have never seen ourselves as aliens. We've always seen ourselves as part of this collective. Yes, we are the islands down south. Yes, that's what we are, the islands down south. The Mississippi flows into us. It flows through the heartland of that nation and it pours out into our world. That is not simply a metaphor. That is nature and politics combined. And so we see ourselves as part of this collective. We emigrate, we land, and as we land, we are looking for opportunities. We are looking to contribute in the arts, entrepreneurship, education, health. We are contributing to entrepreneurship, adding value because we see that space because of the history as partly ours. The Black people of the Caribbean are aware that in that whole slavery period, hundreds of thousands of Caribbean Africans were transported into the American colonies to work, to labor. So in our DNA, we are aware that we have been a part of the North American mainland from the very beginning. So therefore, we cannot accept this notion of ourselves as somehow cut off, adrift, and apart. We reject that because we know our history. It's one journey, a continent and its islands. Islands and their mainland. That's a dialectic. So I would leave it there for now and participate in a broader conversation. I think the history is very interesting. The way in which we imagine the future, also very interesting, but based upon a solid historical pedagogy. Thank you, Professor Pope.
Thank you, Sir Hilary. Sir Hilary, the comments are coming in, and some people are really they're really thankful for the concepts that you shared with them, specifically the importance of multiculturalism and democracy as it emanates from the islands. What I'd like to ask you specifically as the questions come in and people are contemplating the deep knowledge you shared, especially that 1675 date, which you switch around to 1765, is a whole nother phenomenon in terms of the mainland and relationship with the islands. The question I have for you, because of your significant influence in education in the islands, how does this information inform the curriculum? In other words, how do you use, because from what my understanding from being a professor also, that education besides skill set for employment and things like that really does a significant job, especially at higher education, on identity development. And you and I had this conversation a little while ago when we talked about global Africa, concepts of Pan-Africans and what have you. So I'm thinking, because of you being at the helm of one of the greatest universities in the world, that there's an influence in terms of curriculum coherence towards some of these concepts you're raising in terms of the young men and women that you're helping to mold through your curriculum. Can you speak a little bit about it?
Well, you know, I have, as you said, I have the privilege of being the president of a phenomenal university. When President Barack Obama visited with us here at our headquarters in Jamaica 7 years ago, one of the points he made in conversation, he said, well, you know, he had always known from his days as a student at Columbia, he'd always known that UWI, the University of the West Indies, is the leader in social justice. That there's no university in the world with as powerful a record of social justice. Now, if you let us say that this year we are now 73 years old, so we're looking at 7 decades. We started in the 1940s, but how did we begin? We began as a medical school. Why a medical school? Because the people of the Caribbean said that the health condition of working class people in the Caribbean, the public health was a disaster. And that the poor black people in the Caribbean were among the sickest people in the world. So we must deal with that. So we started as a medical school dealing with public health, community medicine, getting out there, training doctors to go out into the community and improve public health, community medicine. That was our launching pad. By the 1950s, we were into independence. The time has come to break away from this British colonial scaffold and assert our American independence. You know, Haiti had started that process first. Then the United States followed. But it was now phase 3. Haiti was phase 1, independence from France. America was phase 2, independence from Britain. And now it was our turn to continue that anti-colonial independence journey. And where was that headquartered? That whole pedagogy, the curriculum, the student consciousness driven by the university. University was the hotbed for independence politics among the students and the young people. Then we got that independence in the 60s. Then another generation of young students and young people said, hold on a second. Yes, we have our independence, but we want justice and equality. Independence is not enough. We want the just society. University then got involved in pedagogy, curriculum development. How do you create the just society? And out of the just society paradigm came the Black Power movement. You know, came the Black Power movement. And we had that Black radicalism saying we cannot accept a society in which traditional white elites own the wealth disproportionately, and the Black people who are in politics, who are the majority in the parliaments and the assemblies, don't have access to economic equality. So that whole discourse started again, the university pedagogy. Then by the 70s and 80s, the next iteration of that came. And socialism as an option. Socialism as an option, democratic socialism, not one party kind of autocratic socialism, democratic socialism, the kind of socialism that Bernie Grant is always talking about. I was saying to my friend just a few days ago, Bernie Grant today speaks the identical language to Caribbean leaders in the 80s. Michael Manley in the 80s was saying exactly what Bernie Grant is saying in 2020. So yes, we went through that, and the university was the heart of it. Then the economists came on board and said, well, how do you convert a former colony into a sustainable economic nation? So the young economists got involved in the economics of development, development economics. And not surprisingly, one of my predecessors, our Vice Chancellor, Sir Arthur Lewis, became the first Black person in the world to have a Nobel Prize in economics. And he got that from the University of the West Indies, his early arguments about economic justice. And now we are in the moment where we are speaking about reparatory justice. And the University of the West Indies is the global vanguard university in the area of reparatory justice. There's a Center for Reparations Research at the university, where all of the issues are being researched to present the region with a strategy for reparations. So the university, the students, the young people, the pedagogy, the curriculum, over 70 years has been on the vanguard of democracy, plurality, diversity. And I suspect that is what President Barack Obama meant when he said that he had picked up in Columbia that this university is really the social justice university of the world.
Well, that's I think that's very interesting. And there's a comment that I'm looking at that noticed that behind me there's a picture of Kwame Nkrumah, which brings me back to the discussion of the Caribbean. I'm currently working with some people about taking my some research into George Padmore, as you mentioned, and of course the CLR James connect. All of these connections, even as we talk about Pan-Africanism, have that Caribbean point. I mean, my first connection, even with the concept, was from Stokely Carmichael as Kwame Ture. But since my travels to Ghana, I'm amazed at the George Padmore contribution, the Nkrumah link, the Padmore link, the Ross McConan link, to the development of the Pan-African idea, which is still to be caught up on. And so I was the audience doesn't know, but we'll share. So Hilary and I had a conversation. We talked about Pan-Africanism and global Africa, and I don't know if I mentioned it in my original comments, but Hilary, this is for the audience to know also, is the editor for the, I guess, upcoming 9th volume of the General Histories of Africa, which is significant to me. And the things that he's saying now, because what happens is when people talk about Pan-Africanism, they don't always recognize the Pan-African concept of global citizenship. And the Caribbean is that example. And the things that you're mentioning are the example that we're talking about. And I'm sure we'll see more about this global African perspective as you prosecute this work and that you continue this work. If you could speak a little about this global Africa and the Caribbean heritage and legacy and the youth and the connections, just for a second, if you have a little bit.
Absolutely. Just to say, Prof. Poe, the African folks in the Caribbean were building upon an advantage, which was the demographics. In most of these islands, because of slavery, because these islands were the center of slavery. Mm-hmm. The slavery model, the notion that you could bring thousands and millions of people across an ocean, put them on something called a plantation, produce a product, export that product, and make big bucks. The notion that that model could work. Yeah. And it would be a good business model for centuries. That experiment was a Caribbean experiment. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the African peoples became the majority in all of these islands, and that gave them an advantage of size, of concentration. Mm-hmm. In the US and our sister colonies, the Africans were generally in the minority. Mm-hmm. Only in South Carolina were they in the majority because South Carolina was a Caribbean colony. It was owned by the Caribbean slave owners. They owned it. They managed it. It was theirs. And they brought it into a majority Black culture. Not surprisingly, when the revolution started, Black people in South Carolina were in the middle of that, the Civil War as well. So what we have is a sense of confidence of numbers. Mm-hmm. that confidence in numbers gave the Africans in the Caribbean a greater sustainability around their philosophy of freedom. It's all about freedom, you know. That's the bottom line. It takes many different permutations, but it's really about freedom and justice. And that's the heart of it. And the Caribbean became the place, not only before the Haitian Revolution.
I see.
I mentioned the 1675 plan in Barbados where coffee was meant to become the king of Barbados. He was an Akan, he was an Asante African, brought out through Elmina, brought to Barbados, and he becomes the leader of the Ashantis on the island. But he was the one who organized this thing, and he was going to be coronated or installed as the king of Barbados. And they had actually created a golden stool out of wood for the ceremony. The 12th of June, 1675, Kofi was going to be installed in a ceremony of the chair and to become the king of Barbados. That is classical African political thinking transported into this island, and from here it spread. So before Toussaint Louverture, this was going on. After Toussaint Louverture, it was still going on. So yes, we do have now this Pan-African consciousness, and there's a famous letter written by C.L.R. James from Trinidad, and he writes to George Padmore from Trinidad, and he writes to him and he says, "Yesterday I met a young man in New York called Kwame Nkrumah. I met this young man, and I am convinced that he is the one. He is the one who is going to throw the English out of Ghana and Africa." So here we have this Caribbean intellectual speaking about meeting this African youth who is the one. He is the one. He is going to throw the English out of Africa. And we have to surround him, and we have to grow him to become that leader. And boy, did he become that leader. So again, all building upon the legacy of Marcus Garvey and W.E. Du Bois. Because it's Du Bois who laid the foundation for that. So again, the American mainland, the islands, Africa, pulling together this Pan-African, Garvey, Du Bois, Padmore, James, Nkrumah, and they built this Pan-African matrix of freedom. And that is what we're dealing with now. So we have just completed volume 9 of Africa history. Of course, it was called the UNESCO History of Africa.
Right.
The UNESCO General History of Africa, volumes 1 to 8, magnificent volumes that decolonize African historical writing. But we came to volume 9 and we said, hold on a second. We're not going to prepare volume 9 in the same tradition. There are probably more Africans around the world than in Africa itself, people of African descent. So this volume 9 has to capture Africans wherever they are, global Africa, whether they are in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia, wherever they are. This volume has to capture global Africans to see the diversity, the plurality, how African peoples have been contributing to all the cultures and civilizations of the world, and where they are now in the vanguard of democracy, freedom, plurality, reparatory justice, all of these issues. That story must be told. It's a fascinating story of humanity. It's about humanity at its best, pushing for freedom and justice and putting hate behind. Because, you know, one of the things we find throughout African civilizations, one of the issues, Prof. Poe, is Africans do not reject their offspring with other races. Isn't that fascinating?
Yes, you're right.
And many other ethnicities, when they have offspring with Africans, they reject them. They're not one of us.
Right.
So the hybrid, the mixed race, they are pushed out. But the African family, whether it has its offspring with Europeans, with Asians, whoever, indigenous peoples of the world, we have always embraced our offspring. And that gives us a tremendous strength a tremendous strength of saying there is something in our consciousness. Maybe it has to do with the fact that humanity emerged out of Africa.
Okay.
And since humanity evolved out of Africa, maybe somewhere in that DNA is a compulsion to always be mother. Maybe that is it, to always be mother. Maybe we don't know. Always be mother. So we embrace and we build that plurality. It's built into our DNA. And we see democracy and freedom as a natural expression of our historical journey as a people.
Very good. Thank you. We have a student leader in the comments area named Pierre Cook. And one of his questions his question is right here. He wants to know if you have some words, Sir Hilary, about the innovative roles to play for these student leaders in transforming social landscape. He wants to know, what can he do right now? Apparently, this is the way that I read his question. And he wants you to possibly suggest some kind of path in terms of transforming their abilities or innovative roles they can play, youth can play in transforming the social landscape.
Absolutely. I'm so proud to engage a student at the Cave campus, UWI. As you know, that was a campus where I was the provost for 12 years and spent some pretty good time there on that campus. But I say this, my message to all students is, young people, always be activists. Build up within your character, your personality, an activist consciousness. Ask yourself, what are the big issues facing my society right now? What are the big issues? Racial justice, climate change, public health, gender injustice. What are the big issues facing my society? And attach yourself to one or many of these conversations. And become a reader, a researcher, an activist, a writer, a spokesperson around one or two or many pillars as you can. But be activists. If you begin a culture of activism around something that you care specifically about, that activism, you do not know where it will take you. Right. But it will take you into a good place. If you demonstrate that I care about these issues, I have commitment. Because if you care and you have commitment, the courage will follow. The courage will follow. And be courageous. Because you cannot imagine your future as a citizen in terms of your insular view of yourself. Right. You're not meant to be that. And if you're a student, you are not meant to be insular. You're meant to be engaged in the big conversations. When I was a student in the United Kingdom, the big conversations were independence for Africa, ending apartheid, getting getting Nelson Mandela out of prison, protecting our West Indian communities from the ravages of racism in the UK. I'm a student, 17 years old, 18 years old, 19, had to attach to those conversations and be a part of that struggle to speak about them, bring it to the attention of the world, build solidarity with other young people. Some of my best friends today were student activists who I met in other universities. In other universities when there was a national forum of youth. And you would meet students from other universities and you would discuss all of these issues. So my answer to you, my friend, is be an activist. Identify which of the national concerns, regional or global concerns, appeals to you, participate in it, do your reading, do your research, have your focus groups, join the movement, and let your voice be heard on those subjects that you feel passionately about.
That's a great answer, Hilary. I think I want to encourage those of you who are on Facebook, if you have a couple of questions, you should send them in quickly because we're nearing the end of our time. We're not rigid, but we do want to be able to allow you to get your questions in before the end of our program. So Hilary, here's a question I wanted to ask you that you're a leader in. I mean, you're a leader in so many things, but this one, as an academician, I'm going to tell you who's on the continent, that you are surely an academic leader that not many of our academic leaders on the continent have yet come to play a similar role. For instance, being the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Committee is so significant because from what I've seen in terms of your presentation of the purpose and the incentive of what reparations actually means, what the repair is in terms of its meaning connected to peace. This is actually the second State Department program I've participated in, sponsored by the State Department. And it is that side of the U.S. government that is concerned about peaceful operations. And I think you make a very coherent argument about the need of reparative justice for peace. And it really catches on everybody's ears that I know that has heard it, but especially the youth. It makes so much sense. So if you could give us a summary presentation of that. Yeah, that would be
Sure, great. Sure. Well, this is why we are committed to the democratic culture. Understand our history. The fundamental feature of our history is that we have experienced fascism. Mm. Our history in the Americas is a history of living with fascism. The slave owner that had control over our lives had a fascist approach to us. You know, they could terminate our lives at a whim and a fancy. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of power that they had over our lives. And this is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, because for 300-400 years, the value proposition of our life outside of labor had no significance for those who owned and controlled us. Yeah. So this is why we are attached to the democratic path, because we know what maximum power is. We know what unaccountable power is. We know what intrusive power is. We have lived that in a way that no other people have. Mm-hmm. So we have a clear view of power. Yes. And we don't like it consolidated and concentrated. We like power to be shared and to be accountable. That makes us the carriers of the democratic seed. Yes. Our young people understand this very, very well. Mm. And this is why the reparatory justice movement is important. Why? Because those who are opposed to reparatory justice for the crimes against humanity that have been committed and the legacies and consequences of that harm continues to be seen everywhere around us. I mean, that George Floyd circumstance where a man is putting the weight of his body on another man's throat and sitting there triumphant. And it's clear to anyone, this was like a fisherman who is displaying his catch on deck of his boat. Mm-hmm. Look what I have caught, look, and showing it. There was that triumphant imagery. That is something that has stayed with us because we know that there's a long history of that. All that has happened is that it was now done in broad daylight. It was not done in the evening, in the den of the night. It was done before the whole world. And so we know that history. So the thinking is that those who are opposed to reparatory justice for these crimes, their primary subliminal argument is the longer we push this encounter into the future, the longer we delay the moment of reckoning, further and further into the future, the sting and the pain of the injustice will dissipate, so that each generation of Black youth would feel less and less attached to their ancestral experience. So those who are opposed to reparations are saying, let us invest in the Black youth. Let us keep them further, push the conversation further and further and further. 50 years from now, maybe the Black youth would be saying, reparations? What is that?
Mm-hmm.
What are you talking about? I mean, that was a million years ago. I have no interest in that conversation. And that is their strategy.
Yeah.
Our task, therefore, is to keep the youth educated, to keep them attached, keep them informed. Ask them to become activists on this platform. No. You heard your parents, you heard your grandparents. Be activists on it. Don't let them use you. You have a duty as the next generation of youth to stand up for these values. And this is what is happening. And so the global Black youth, Black Lives Matter movement is a movement of the young people. And the young people have done it again. They have built a global movement using the technologies for organization, using the communications technologies. But they have built a movement that is changing the world. Justice for everyone. No more inequalities. We want freedom and justice. And the young people and those young Black men and women in America who organize this and democratize it to everyone, to embrace everyone. It is phenomenal. Once again, the youth have shown that they, in the final instance, they are going to be the masters of this world. They're going to change it. And I do not know what will be the next stage of the Black Youth Matter movement. It will probably have its 20 years of change in the world, and it would evolve into another language. It will continue to evolve. But what I do know is that it will be driven out of the consciousness of young people, and we are in their hands, and therefore we bless them.
Well, I think one of the things that you said, and we are nearing, there are a bunch of comments of people really appreciating the history that you shared with them. Some professors are on the line, and they appreciated the history you shared. Hopefully you'll be able to see the shared comments on that. But one thing you said, I think that's also crucial when it comes to Black Lives Matter. From the Caribbean early on, like you mentioned, Black Lives Matter. And you mentioned this before, it's the value. And I even think that the concept of Black power, which even though Richard Wright is the first to write the term in public literature, it was Caribbean emanated Kwame Ture who popularized the term with the ferociousness that comes from the personality you described. But I think that what this will do, this Black Lives Matter movement, once it re-grabs the fact that if your life matters and you want value, you have to have some power to ensure you have it. That kind of personality that you said, that kind of global African personality to accept all children that come from the creation of the global African reality is what allows us to, I think, move to a powerful base. And I'm hoping that the youth are able to articulate this, to move to a powerful base that doesn't require the oppression of a subgroup that we've been in contact with. You shared this with me. You really don't have all the time, I know, to share it all in this, but I want to share the enlightenment I think you gave me in the conversation. And you did mention it here, is that when that kind of African personality, not just traditional, but also contemporary African personality, touches your nation, it's the best chance for almost all of the people in your nation to be recognized in their own culture without having to give up self in order to join this kind of human family. And I think that that's a brilliant presentation that you've given and shared with our audience. Hopefully more folks will hear more about what you're doing in that area. And I want to give this last opportunity for anybody else who has a comment or question if they want to ask. And let me let you have the last word on this. And then I'd like to thank all of the producers of today's program. But Professor Sir Hilary, there is a question here. Let me see if there's a question in it. This is a comment that's thankful for your summary. And it's another professor again who is somewhat encouraged in their classes, are encouraged by the knowledge that the connection you make between the islands and the continent. And that's so important that people are very well informed on this. I have another one from Java Steely. Just want to see if there's a question in it. Oh, yes. Could you explain to those young people and ordinary citizens, it's right there in front of you. Could you explain to those professionals, to those young people and ordinary citizens who still can't see the value of such a move, why this is essential for power? And this is dealing with, if there's still time, briefly why the Caribbean islands within CARICOM should be republics as a means of achieving. I think we have more of that comment. Let me see if I can get to it. Or if we get some help.
I can read that, yes.
Oh, okay, good,
I see that, yes. Well, you know, we while we are idealistic, we also are practical. Right. And leadership is very important. When most of the countries in the English-speaking Caribbean became independent in the 60s and 70s, the leaders who were driving that moment, young people, young political leaders who were driving that independence movement, they were faced with a very important decision. Here we are, young political people, young black men and women, in our 30s and 40s, and we have political leadership responsibility. We are moving forward. But our parents, our elders, were on the conservative side of that conversation. Mm-hmm. They were quite prepared to stay in a colonial relationship with Britain because many of them still had a celebratory consciousness about Britain, despite the history. And that is what history does, the brainwashing. So the independence moment, driven by young people, but young leaders conscious that their parental generation were not with them. And therefore, they took a decision that we were not going to put independence to a referendum. Because if they had put independence as a referendum and asked all the adults to vote, should we stay colonial or should we go to independence, they were fearful that the majority would have said, let us stay with the colonial package. So they didn't do it that way. What they did instead, they put independence into the manifesto of the election. They put it into their manifesto. If you vote for us, we will improve healthcare, we will improve education, we will improve agriculture, we will improve the infrastructure, we will move to independence. And they put the independence in a package of things. And when they won the election, they took that electoral victory as a mandate. And then they went to independence without a referendum. They skillfully said we have a mandate. And that was brilliant leadership because they were fearful. So here we are today. I suspect the similar situation. And this is why leadership is so important. So we are always hoping that we will have some young, intellectually astute, committed young leaders who know what needs to be done. They understand the generational divide, but they will do their part and find a way to move us forward. Mm-hmm. So always the leadership, youth leadership is the key, because invariably it's young consciousness dragging older consciousness along through time. You know, sometimes you have to drag your folks, your older folks kicking and screaming, you know, but that is the nature of history and it rolls on. So everyone has their responsibility, and the young people have their responsibility to be courageous and to provide visionary leadership. The rest of us old folks will say, well, this is what the young people want. Let's follow. And that really is how it works out in the end.
So, Hilary, this has been for me, a great opportunity to share space with you. Your presentation, of course, is brilliant, as usual. And since we are still a little bit in the Zoomiverse, we will probably bring this session to a close. Though this is probably the best we could do on Zoom. I mean, to have you here to present this information with us. Let me take this opportunity to say thank you and also to thank Ambassador Linda Tagliatella, who is the ambassador for the area there. I think they're doing great work there. And of course, my friend Larry Socha, Public Affairs Officer, and Nikita Holder, and the hard work that she put together to pull the program together as the Cultural Affairs Assistant locally. And so I think I will take this opportunity then to close us so we can run to lunch in our other Zoom meetings from this moment of nutrition in terms of knowledge. And say again, sir, thank you. I'm going to reach out to you soon so I can get involved with. And I'll allow you the last word.
Thank you so very much. What a wonderful engagement with you, Professor Poe. Always good to be in good company and to have hosting our ambassador, Linda, who is very much loved across the Caribbean. Thank you all for this experience, and all of you who are in the Zoom world. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your citizenship of Zoomland. We had a good time, and let us continue to look into the future with a positive consciousness.
Thank you.
Thank you.